All right. Well, if you started the conversation, you'll probably draw close. If you hated the entire experience, you might be ice out. And if you left and are in the lobby now, you might be a grenade launcher.
I feel like there's so many more options we could have
There
given,
are. It's just to get the conversation going.
I know.
I'm probably a combination of ice out and grenade launcher, so I'm a lot of fun.
I know. I think I'm all three.
I'm a lot of fun to be around.
Multilingual in our communication.
That's good. Well, I'm so glad that y'all are here. Thanks for taking time out of your Sunday morning to join us. We don't take it lightly. I think it's really important that regardless of where you are in the spiritual spectrum, whether you're watching with us online or here in the room, that you take a moment to mark each week to be a part of what God's doing, and especially in the conversation that we're in this series about relationships. It's just so critical. So just to honor you with that and say thanks for being here. We're both up here today, like Kevin and Tracy said.
Yep.
I'm Pastor Kurt.
I'm Pastor Katie.
And we are married, but today is not about marriage, right? As we're in this series.
We're also coworkers.
We also are coworkers.
Co-parents.
That's right. And that's mostly where our communication falters happen. But, you know, we have had a lot of time together, and as we get into this conversation, no matter where you're at on the spiritual spectrum or wherever you're at on the relationship status spectrum, this series is designed to help all of us take a real look at an area of our life that, if we're honest, even those of us that feel like our relationships are doing well have taken a hit over the last couple of years. There's no doubt about it. Research has shown in the church, outside the church, relationships in general are struggling. And so that's why we called this series Relationship Rehab. This is going to be a little bit of a rehab session today. We're all here in the hospital together, so don't worry. You don't have to do any confessions or anything like that. We're just going to do most of the talking. It's not going to be that weird. But we're going to be honest about one of the major hangups that people have in their relationships, whether they're married, whether they're engaged, whether they're roommates, coworkers, parents, neighbors, or whatever relationship that you're in. How we communicate is so incredibly important. And so we started off with this quote, right, from Pete Scazzero in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, to kind of kick off the series last week. It says this. It says, the sad reality is that most of us, this is certainly true for me, will never move forward until the pain of staying the same eclipses where we are, right? The pain of staying the same is unbearable. Right? And so for many of us, that has been our reality these last couple of years. The pain of how our relationships have been working has become really painful. Like how this is working is not working. Yeah. And so we want to move forward together and find new ways to do that.
Yeah, and I love just starting from a place of hope. You know, last week, Kurt kicked off this whole idea and just this beautiful picture that Jesus actually gave. He said that it's actually not the sick who need a doctor, or it's not the healthy who need the doctor, it's the sick. And so it's this beautiful invitation for all of us, because relationships are important, to be aware of the places in our relationships where maybe part of our relationship is sick. You know, we looked at last week how we can restore our awareness, and we added some new emotional vocabulary. You know, we talked about this idea that the me I bring to we is important, and at any given time, in any relationship that you're in, there's always the seen and there's always the unseen. And we gave you what we hope is a helpful tool that we called Sachet, where we walked through what are these core emotions. I
don't know if that's a sachet. Yeah.
Clearly you did not do it that way. It's spelt wrong. But so hopefully y'all got to like sachet a little bit. That's how I remember it. But walk through sad, angry, scared, happy, excited, tender, this acronym that helps us identify what are these core emotions at any given time. I can he and haw around it. I could kind of put my emotions on the shelf for a little bit, but eventually they will surface up. Eventually they will come in and affect the relationship that I'm in, and it's true of every single one of us. And so I hope that was a helpful tool for you. And today we're going to kind of build upon that. Today we're going to kind of build upon how do we actually kickstart healthy communication. That's what we're calling it. We're calling it this idea of, I said this, you heard what? And if you're in a relationship that is, you know, beyond maybe a month or two deep, if you know that we get to a point in our relationships, we've been married 16 and a half, coming up on 17 years. We've been parents for 8 years. And so the deeper you go into relationship with someone, that doesn't always necessarily mean that communication gets easier. It just means through each
Really
season.
wish it was true, but it's not.
I really did, right?
Yeah,
It
it'd be
should
great.
be. It should be. But each season your relationship grows and progresses. It requires us to gain new skills, new ways of transforming, of growing together in each new season of our relationship. And so whether you are here today and you're thinking about a relationship, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a coworker, maybe it's a spouse, maybe it's another family member, that maybe you have had a moment like that where you feel like you said something to try to make it feel better and it just went sideways. And you're like, how did we get here? How do we keep having these what we call recycled fights where we get into the same pattern? So we're going to talk about a little bit of that. We'll hopefully pull the curtain back a little bit and let you see us a little bit, but we really want to get at the heart of that, of how do you make sure that what you're saying is actually getting across and landing and is building something beautiful in your relationships. In fact, in all of our years of talking with and working with couples, families, people, never once have we sat down with people who are struggling in their relationship. Never once have we heard them say, you know what? You know what our problem is? We just communicate too much.
Yeah.
Our problem is that we just feel so seen and understood. I feel so listened to and heard. It's like my deepest feelings and needs are just understood, and I barely have to say it. Said no one ever,
Yeah.
including us.
True.
And so that is sort of our launching point. That's kind of where we are starting from today. And here's the funny thing, friends, is because we're not up here because we're laughing because we're not up here talking about this because we're experts. Like just this week, preparing for a talk about communication, it feels like all of these like grenades of circumstance were kind of thrown and tested. Our very communication itself. I've had kind of this ear infection for the last 2 weeks that still is not healed fully. So I've literally been for almost 3 weeks now, deaf on one side. And so that really makes it hard to hear and communicate when you feel like every time I'm trying to hear something, what'd you say? And I can only hear if I'm really looking at, reading lips. It's been a very humbling.
I enunciate so well, which is also super helpful.
Yes, and Kurt does not mumble. Mm-hmm. He speaks very clearly. And so it's been this little testing ground for us. And then throw in 2 kids getting the stomach flu that's going around and very little sleep. So we all want you to know that true communication is brought to the surface when it's not ideal, when you have all of the extenuating circumstances that are outside of your control. Yeah. That is what shows you truly how your communication is. So a lot of this teaching is really fresh for us.
Yeah, real talk. Yeah, we'll see how today goes. It'll be fun. But as Katie mentioned, Dr. John Gottman, in case you don't believe us, right, is a world-renowned marriage and family therapist, and his kind of team, and they did a bunch of research, and they determined what Pastor Katie just said, that actually in any relationship, regardless of its spouse, partner, friend, coworker, neighbor, any consistent relationship, that 70% of the conflicts in that relationship come up over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. So what that means is that you and I, and you and the person that you're thinking of when we talk about relational conflict and communication, the person that you're thinking of, that the conflicts that you have with them are actually very recycled. And so obviously we're not getting things worked out. And if you think about it, if you're married, if you have a child you're parenting, right, you probably have the same difficult conversations over and over and over again, right? There's this loop that we find ourselves on. And so something has to shift. How do we find a way to actually communicate so that things actually get better? So that's the hope for today, is that you and I would learn how to communicate with other people in those relationships, right? So that those conflicts that we have would become less recycled, less consistent. We wouldn't have the same stuff different day, right? So what that means is we have to decide to do something different if we want to see a different result.
Yeah, exactly. Because if we could just do better, right? If it just came down to trying harder, we'd have done it by now.
Right. Everyone wants to be better.
Everyone wants our relationships, to be better and to be stronger. And so what we hope again today is that this shift would happen for all of us, to have transforming relationships, not to just keep plugging away and hold on tighter and just determined not to give up or just to stay together for the kids, or all of the things that our culture around us kind of says, well, if it's not going to be perfect, you might as well just settle for getting through it. But we want our relationships to be transforming. We want our relationships to be life-giving. And the truth is, in that order for it to be that, both parties have work to do. And so maybe for you, you're like, okay, I can surely do some things better, but I really kind of need that person to step up their game. And to be honest, every single one of us has someone in our life who we wish would get to work on all the stuff that they need to fix in order to bring a healthier person into the relationship. But the truth is, the only one who really has the power to do that in your relationship is you. And so even though you can't control someone else, you can take radical responsibility for yourself. And so that is some of the work that we're going to step into, because, we truly do. We all have someone in our lives who we hope will get into that work. So we're going to take responsibility today for ourselves and see what happens.
Because we also probably have someone who hopes we get to work soon as well. So that's the goal. So to get started, I would invite you, if you have a copy of the scriptures, you can grab it and turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 14. If you're watching online, you can open up another tab. We're going to go here where the Apostle Paul, someone who became a follower of Jesus kind of later in life, he was very set in his ways before this and had a absolutely radical transforming experience with Jesus. And it made him rethink how he did all kinds of things in his life, including relationships. And so he's writing to a group of Christians in the city of Corinth, and they're having some struggles, right? They're having some relational conflict in their church. They're the only one that has ever had conflict in church, I think, in history. But he helps us understand how we can. Someone laughed. I appreciate that. Everybody else was too awkward. Like, is he talking about me? So here's what we're going to look at today. This is, again, important advice. It's so easy for us to go, oh yeah, I should have invited them. Like, they need to hear this, right? But again, we're in rehab together, all right? So hi, I'm Kurt. I have a problem with communication. Hi, Kurt. There you go. Some of you know, right? Okay, so we're gonna do some internal work as we read this passage together. All right. So 1 Corinthians chapter 14, starting in verse 6, it says this. Paul's writing to these people. He says, "Dear brothers and sisters, if I should come to you speaking in an unknown language, how would that help you?" Again, this is deep biblical stuff right now, right? "But if I even bring you a revelation and some special knowledge or prophecy or teaching, that will be helpful. Even lifeless instruments like a flute or a harp must play the notes clearly, or no one will recognize the melody. If a bugler," right, that's a fun word to say, "doesn't sound a clear call, how will the soldiers know that they're being called into battle?" So he's painting this metaphorical picture, right? It doesn't matter how important what you have to say is, doesn't matter how godly it is, doesn't matter how transforming the information in your brain that needs to come out of your mouth for this other person is. If you and I are not clear, it does us no good. He says it's the same for you, right? If you speak to people in words that they don't understand, how will they know what you're saying? You might as well be talking into empty space. And some of you are like, I know what that feels like, right? I know what that feels like. And that's exactly what Paul is saying. He said, we all have this experience where we've tried to say what we need to say, and the other person just doesn't hear it. And so the question is, do we pause and say, maybe I need to adjust? Or do we just stay and blame and go, well, they didn't get it. It's on them.
Yeah, I mean, our communication, we so often focus on what we want to say. I mean, don't you? Like when you're in a position where you're all bristled up or you feel that like fast heartbeat or whatever it is when your body is telling you like, I'm mad or something needs to be said, right? Or you're staying up late at night having the like stress dream conversation, imaginary, like how it's going to go down that you're just going to like say the thing and they're going to be like, whoa, and it's going to be like problem solved, right? We all have these little
much. Yeah.
right? We all have these little like fantastical worlds that we live in our minds. But the truth is, when we so often are focused on what we're going to say or how right we are or what it is from our perspective of how we see the situation, just like the Apostle Paul says here to the Ephesians, like we can so often miss what's happening. We can so often miss the actual piece of communication that God might have for us, which is to actually learn and to pay attention to how is this landing for them? How is my communication actually being heard? Are we being clear in our communication in order to be helpful to others? Because if our communication is not understood by the other people, that we're communicating, just like Paul just said to these Corinthians, right? Then it's useless. It's just noise, right? It doesn't actually transform anything. It just goes out into the abyss and just stays stuck. But when we can get our communication clear, amazing things, harmonies, revelation, and progress can happen in our relationships. And here's why. The big why is because helpful communication leads to relational transformation, right? Helpful communication leads to relational transformation. This is what Apostle Paul said to these Corinthians, and I think that's what he is saying to us today. This same biblical principle shows up in real time in our real life relationships. And the thing is that we know this cognitively, right? We can wrap our minds around that. Yes, that like totally makes sense.
Yeah, nobody was like, what?
Nobody was like, oh my gosh, I'm hearing this brand new information. But so many of us have difficulty actually being clear in our communication, right? Why? Why is that? Why is it so hard when all of our emotional defenses rise, right? When we have all of our swirling thoughts of what's right and wrong and what needs to be said, right? When we're in this space, so often that's the perfect recipe for having unclear communication, right? So that's the work for us because we fear that clear communication will be perceived as intense or unkind, right? Clear so often feels rudimentary or patronizing. But here's an important statistic. 93% of couples and 86% of workplace employees that were surveyed at the University of Texas in Austin, that research on relationships have named communication as one of their top 3 struggles, right? So cognitively, we know this, that communication is often a struggle in our relationships. And this isn't just the words that are spoken, it can be the words that are unspoken as well. Right? Because if we've been in relationships, we all probably know what it feels like. As pastors, we know how it feels to sit on the other side of someone who's walking through their family of origin or walking through a failed relationship, and there's this ache that they still hold, this longing that they still have to hear the words that they maybe never heard. Words like, I'm proud of you. Words like, I'm sorry. Words like, I love you, you matter, I'm here with you, no matter what. When you need me, I'm gonna be here, right? Some of us maybe never heard those words, and so there is this vacuum or this void that we're constantly searching for spaces in our relationships to heal or fix or fill those voids. And nothing underscores the reality of how powerful our words are and how much they matter than the fact that even unspoken words carry power, doesn't it? Right? That even unspoken words can shape the trajectory of our lives, can shape our desires, our longings, right? These affect our relationships in powerful ways. So if we want to get better at something, if we want to get something different than we currently have, we've got to be willing and ready to do something different than what we have ever done. Different than we've seen, maybe in our own families, maybe in our parents' marriage, maybe in our past relationship, right? We've got to be able to imagine and trust God that there's a future that's better than our current reality.
Yeah, so if we want to write a better story in our relationships, we have to take some responsibility, right? And it's the false dichotomy that culture paints that we all kind of, whether we realize it or not, buy into in our relationships, is that if we're in a relationship, we actually often see it more like a competition than a collaboration. Right? That if I'm going to win, she has to lose. Or if the boss is going to win, the employees have to lose. Or if you're going to win, your neighbor is going to lose, right? And whatever it might look like, right? Whether it's parenting, whether it's on the team, whether it's at work, that there is this idea that there is a scarcity, there is a limited quantity of love and understanding. And yet for those of us that have decided to follow Jesus, we actually have to pause and recognize, no, we're actually attached to the source of love and belonging. And so there is not this false dichotomy of win and lose. That actually, when we follow Jesus, we are invited to see other people in our life, lover, friend, neighbor, and enemy, as mutually beneficial, right? And so that even those that we don't get along with, even those that we don't like, we are to view them and view our relationship with them as a possibility for mutual beneficial experiences, right? And so that totally changes the game, right? These are like new rules for relationships that Jesus offers us. And so when we operate in this new way, this mutually beneficial type of relationship, the idea of losing and fear of blame and fear of responsibility begins to diminish over time. It's not instant. Gosh, I wish it was. Like, oh, I started following Jesus now. I can just take all responsibility and never cast blame on anyone else in my life. That's not realistic, right? But when I'm really, truly aware of who God is, who I am in God, what God has invited me to do in my relationships, I can actually see that accepting responsibility isn't as scary, right? We say it this way, that when we accept responsibility rather than extend blame, it actually empowers others to do the same. And my guess is when you heard Katie say a moment ago that actually there are two people that need to take responsibility for a relationship to work, and that's true, but you can only control yourself. You had this thought of like, well, what if I lose? Well, what if I do this and then he just takes advantage of me? Or what if I do this and they just like walk all over me? Or what if I do this and they get the promotion instead of me? And I get that fear, right? I totally understand that. I share it. But the truth is that when you and I in our relationships begin to accept responsibility, two things will happen. It will actually empower other people to do the same, or it will demonstrate that they don't know how. Right? And then you and I can then begin to set different boundaries in our relationships. But in healthy relationships with healthy people, right, which is what we all want, when I step in to take responsibility, to accept that I had a part of this that I played, as small as it might be, or as large as it might be, it actually empowers the other person on the other side of me, the other person I'm in a relationship with, to actually do the same.
Yeah, and that's right. I mean, it sounds so like easy when you're just saying it on a stage with a Britney Spears microphone strapped to your face, but in real life, how does this like actually show up? How does this actually go to work in our lives? And I love that the Apostle Paul, we just read from Corinthians, it was his letter that he wrote to some Christians, giving them some advice, giving them some feedback of things that he's heard. And we're about to read from another letter to some other friends that he wrote in Ephesus, who these friends, similarly, they were, the church was brand new. They had heard all these things. Many of them had seen what Jesus had done, and they were this new upstart church figuring out how to do this following Jesus thing. And so we know what we don't want in relationships. In many ways, this rural little community, they were figuring it out too. And so Paul kind of gives them some of the do's and don'ts. And so if you want to follow along with me, we're going to look at another passage from Ephesians 4. It's on page 705. And, like we say every week, if you don't have a Bible, if you don't have one of these that you can read, that you can understand, we truly believe that God reveals so much about his heart, right? At the heart of God is one who wants to communicate with us, one who wants to make his heart known to us so that we can live these transformed lives. So we say this every week. If you have a Bible that's like crazy these and thous and you don't really understand what it's saying, take this home. This Bible in your hands is now yours to keep because we believe it will change your life. So side note over, back in, so these Christians in Ephesus, they were wrestling with the same things you and I wrestle with. And Paul actually gives them some great words on how to actually do this, how to actually see these transforming principles come to life, how to actually speak to one another. Right? This is really important because if we've been in any kind of relationship where it started to go sideways or there were some toxic things that we started noticing in the relationship, some things that we were like, whoa, you can't talk to me like that. Paul speaks to those very things. So page 705, chapter 4, verse 29, or you can follow it along on the screen. It says this, page 706. All right, it says, don't let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths. Let everything you say be good and helpful so that your words will be an encouragement to those who hear them. Right? Okay, so these are the do's. Right? And here he gets into some of the don'ts. And do not bring sorrow to God's Holy Spirit by the way that you live. Remember that God has identified you as his own. Right? That means God has put part of who he is in you. That you represent, that you show something bigger than just yourself, that you actually show God to the people around you in your life, right? He's identified you as his own, guaranteeing that you will be saved on the day of redemption. So get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, right? Slander, gossip, putting others down, right? As well as all types of evil behavior, and instead be kind to each other. Be tender-hearted, forgiving one another, just as God, through Christ, has forgiven you. Right? Forgiving one another. See, that is the difficult work that God calls us to, right? Because there's all these do's and don'ts, right? This list is pretty long of what not to do: bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, slander, evil, right? And it's as if Paul goes on without skipping a beat, because he knows in our humanity, we're not going to get it right all the time. That we can have this list of do's and all the things that we want to be true of our lives in the way that we talk to each other, right? We want our words to be helpful and true and honest and good. But the reality is that we're not going to be perfect, that we're going to need this forgiveness. So I love that he sandwiches it. All of this good, do this, don't do this. But when you get it wrong, forgive one another, because Christ has forgiven you. Because Jesus has already made a way for us to have transformation in our relationships. And now the word that Paul uses here to describe unwholesome, right? It literally means rotten, foul, or useless. It means it's something that's going to continue to cause problems. He's not just saying, okay, don't cuss and we'll be good. As long as you don't say these 4 words, these four-letter words, right? As long as you don't say these words, you're good. No, what he's saying is that using any of these words that are going to cause something to rot or smell or to be just useless, it's going to be just dead weight that you carry. It's actually going to hurt you long term. So get rid of those things, right? Get rid of those things that are only going to continue to cause pain in your relationships. When Paul's giving this counsel, he says there's more than just don't do these things, right? He said this should actually build something up. This should be, your words should be something that builds something beautiful, right? That your relationship should look better because of the way that you communicate, that there's actually the power for that in your words. So the first step is to realize that our communication is not about us, meaning that what I felt I said matters less, right? That what I felt I said, the point I thought I got across matters way less than what the person on the other side of me actually heard, right? That I can leave my desire to be right or to prove my point to say, whoa, your heart matters so much more than my point, right? And so if we can get to that place in our relationships where we care so much more about building up the person than proving our point, sometimes we could be right, friends, but we can still tear down the relationship. You've probably been on the other end of a person like that, would be my guess. And so yes, how do we make sure that what we say is a building up, is an encouragement to those around us, right? We've learned this a lot by doing it the hard way, and we've also gotten it right a couple of times. You know, I would say in the last couple of years, even with the pandemic, we've come out of these crazy years, as much as our marriage and our relationship and our parenting and our pastoring has been tested, it has really forged some beautiful strength in our relationship. It has really matured us in some ways. And so we wanted to share a couple of things that rise to the surface for us when we think of what are some of our rules to live by. When we see, you know, the words of Paul, when we see how in our modern day lives can we put these words to practice. And so we want to share a couple of things with you, 4 questions really to ask when we are to examine the words that come out of our mouth and how we communicate. How do we make sure that the things we're saying are, as Paul encourages, are good and helpful, are going to build us up, are going to encourage others. And so the 4 questions that we ask, and we're not perfect at it, but over the years, it's kind of this little running list that go, okay, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? Is it timely? All right, a little slower. First one, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it kind? And is it timely? Right? These are 4 questions that have dramatically shaped our communication, our team, our leadership. When we're going into a hard conversation, with a teammate or with, a previous boss or something, these are 4 questions that have helped and served us time and time again. And we're going to take a minute, going to go through each one a little bit.
My guess is as you hear that, though, you're like, man, that would be a really helpful filter. right? That's our hope, is that this becomes the filter through which you let your words go as you're in communication with your most important relationships, so that you don't verbally open the fridge, go, wow, something is rotten in there, and then just close it up again and go, cool, let's come back to it later. Because that's what we do, right? And that's what this idea that Kay said, like, it's unwholesome means it's foul. And there's times when you have been in conversations where someone didn't ask these questions, or worse, I know I've had this experience, you probably have as well, you didn't ask the questions of your own words, and you saw it on your kid's face, or you saw it on your teammate's face, or your roommate, or your spouse's face. Like, oh, I just opened the door, and there was something foul in that refrigerator, and I can see it, that it bothered them. So when we ask these questions, the first one, like he said, is it true? Right? And like, that can seem so rudimentary at first, right? Like, oh, I'm only going to say things that are true. But let's actually press into that. Because often we can mistake truth for what I think. And when you actually pause and go, is this true, or do I just think it's true? It actually changes the conversation, right? We had our old boss had a mentor that said this. It says, being honest doesn't mean that everything that's true is something that you say. It simply means everything that you say is something that's true. Because there's so many times where I've said too much truth. We're going to get into that in just a second, and it actually hurt the relationship, right? But even deeper than that, right? Like, even deeper than just saying, like, oh, is it actually factual? That's a great starting line. But the question is, am I being true? Is my heart pure and true as I'm saying this thing, right? Because it's just as important to have true intent as it is to have true content, right? It's just as important to have a true intent as it is to have true content. If you only focus on what you're saying is true, and then say, hey, it's true, I'm just going to say it. Maybe you were raised that way. I know I have that tendency, like, hey, it's true, just hard truth. Life's hard sometimes, truth hurts. You can be true and may not have anyone left to say it to. You know what I'm saying? Right? So just because it's true doesn't mean it has to be said. But let's make sure everything that we do say is true.
Yeah. The next one is it helpful? Like that passage from Ephesians, right? Our job is to build up. Imagine a construction site. It means that, when we're done the conversation, if a construction worker shows up on the job and is like doing their thing and they just walk away and nothing is left, or that more damage is done, they're going to have a talk with their boss later that afternoon or that evening or the next day, right? So when we think about our relationships, right, when we show up and have a conversation, there should be something left standing. If we're coming in and it's helpful, that our hope is that we build something stronger than it was before. Right. Maybe there's an insightful thing, that maybe there's these 7 things I knew about before going into the conversation, but maybe it's that 8th thing that I didn't know that was really helpful information to know. That maybe out of those 7 things that are true, that 8th thing is actually the game changer. That 8th helpful fact was actually what helps me see the person on the other side of me. And so is something helpful, right? Is what I'm saying helpful? And is the way that I'm listening and hearing what the other person, and sometimes even reiterating back what the other person has said, is a helpful way to make sure that you are internalizing what's being said and reflecting it back to them. That is a really helpful way to make sure that the communication is building up in a productive way. And here's the other thing. Sometimes, for those of you that may be conflict averse or communication, hard conversations creep you out, sometimes that means leaning in and sharing what's true, even when your natural tendency is to hang back or to convince yourself that it's not really that big of a deal, right? Love speaks up. Love builds up the other person, is also ready to see them. It's also ready to say, here's what I see, but can you tell me a little bit about what I might not see? And there's definitely ways to say hard things that are immensely helpful. You've probably had, maybe I hope everyone has had a boss or a friend or someone who was courageous enough to share something with you to say, hey, because I believe in you, I'm actually going to take the risk to say what might be hard, but at the risk of helping you grow or of helping our friendship get better, because they see something in you and are courageous enough to speak up.
So good. The third one is it kind, right? And this is as simple and as difficult as saying, what's it like to be on the other side of me, right? It's saying, I'm going to put the other person on the other side of me above me. And this is, friends, those of us that have decided to start following Jesus, this is what this looks like in our relationships, right? Is that we actually tailor our words to meet their needs. Because let's be honest, so often I can be so focused on myself in communication, and I can get so confident because I've rehearsed it like 5 or 6 or 100 times. This is the first time they're hearing it, but I'm ready, right? And I'm so confident that they need to hear what I have to say. And when I'm done saying it, I feel so good because I said what I needed to say, and I thought that was success in the conversation. But really what the Apostle Paul encourages us in Ephesians 4 is to say, hey, actually, when you're done saying it, just because you feel better, that's not actually the goal. It's great, it's a step, it's important, but that's not actually the goal of communication when we're following Jesus. It's to actually say, was this kind? So again, is it true? That's where we start. Is it helpful? But then can I say something that's true and helpful in a way that is kind, that is gentle, that is caring, again, for the other person?
And the last one is timely. This is really important, and for us, this is probably the one that is the most difficult. Many of you maybe in the room are weary parents, or you're in a season of life where you're caring for aging parents, or you're in grad school or whatever it is. The timely piece is important, right? There's a time and a place for different kinds of communication. And this is the difference between mature and immature communication. See, children, now I have 3 little ones, and they often just say whatever's on their mind, whenever they're thinking it, it's coming out of their mouth. There is zero filter, right? And some of us are adults, but because we haven't figured this out, we still sometimes get stuck in this childish relationship.
Why are you
trait.
looking at me?
I'm not looking
No,
at you.
just kidding.
Once in a while, but not. You're pretty good. You're pretty good. And so here's the deal, friends. The invitation. What's for us? Because it's so often times like we have to be in the right space to have the right conversation. There's times where we'll be getting into it, and yes, we fight. Just for those of you, a heated disagreement. No, sometimes we straight up need to talk through some stuff. But if it's in the middle of dinner time or putting the kids down, we're like, trying to have this conversation now is not going to help our cause.
Right.
And so we'll say, hey, because this conversation is so important, we're going to need to just time out for a second and wait until we can constructively have the conversation where we can both bring a level head, where we can both maybe take a minute, take a walk around the neighborhood, do what we got to do to feel like we can bring a healthy heart space to the conversation. And so that sometimes takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of discipline and self-control and wisdom and practice, but it's definitely worth the wait. And the right thing at the wrong time feels like the wrong thing.
Yeah.
We've definitely
So
felt
true.
that before. All right, so maybe you're feeling like, wow, that's a lot. It might even feel like it's too much work. And maybe you are like, whoa, I don't even know about this. I'm kind of just like figuring out the whole God thing. And here's just what I want to say. Maybe there's just one of those questions that you start with. Maybe for you, you're like, man, is that how much work it is to follow Jesus? I believe that Jesus does ask a lot of us, but he also, on the other side of that work, has beautiful, restored, healthy relationships. He has fruit and amazing things that can come out of our relationships. And you don't have to do this in order to follow Jesus. It's totally optional. But Jesus does invite us to speak of others this way, because that is the heart of God. That is how God thinks towards you. That the words of God are true, are helpful, are kind, and are timely, right? Because that's God's heart for us. He wants to build us up. He wants to encourage us as well. Right? And when we take responsibility rather than extend blame in our relationships, it empowers others to do the same, just like we said earlier. So I want us to just imagine if we all did this, right? If we all lived this way, if we all valued one another enough to build them up in the way that we speak to one another. Paul also said it this way to the Romans. He said, do all that you can to live at peace with everyone. That means you and me are charged with this invitation.
Yeah.
And if you're following Jesus, he leans in. This is our encouragement. This is our command to do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. Because no one has ever traced their relationship problems back to too much helpful communication, you and I are actually empowered by Jesus to create a relationally transformational practice in our relationships, that we can actually transform not only ourselves, but we can be a glimpse of hope for other people as well by the way that we simply value and get better at our communication. And when we implement this, the second habit that we begin to see and to sustain our relationship health, right? The second thing is that it builds our hope. It builds our hope and our confidence in who we are. It helps us to approach God confidently, that when we pray, we can trust that our prayers are heard by one that sees us, that cares, and desires good for our life.
Yes, we just want to pray for you as you're thinking about this space that you want to grow in with your relationships, with your communication. And I just invite you to take a prayer posture that we take around here where we just want to open our hands and say, God, I'm open to whatever it is you want to do. Maybe you were taught to fold your hands and close your eyes and bow your head and get as small and tiny as you could. That's just because they didn't want you to mess around with the person next to you. So we're adults, right? But it's just the idea of, God, I want to posture my body in a way that says, actually, I'm open to the work you might be inviting me to do in this. Like, there's something I need to gain, something I need to grow in when it comes to communication. So let's pray for you. God, thank you that you are a God who speaks words that are true, speaks words that are kind, that you adapt your communication to us because you value the relationship with us more than just being right. And that ultimately your words and your ways, Jesus, are helpful. And so God, as we take that into consideration, I pray that that would become true of us as well. That no matter where we're at relationally, no matter where we're at spiritually, that we would guard our communication by asking these 4 questions so that we can experience relational transformation because of improved communication. God, I pray that, as Katie said, that the world would begin to see glimpses of you. The people on the other side of us would see glimpses of you because of how they interact and how they hear us communicate with them. We need your help with this, God. So we pray this in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen.